Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this edition of Defense News Weekly, we'll preview the upcoming defense budget. We'll also find out the details on a new nuclear weapon and look at the problems of Congress and tech literacy. With in-depth interviews, up-close video, and leading analysis, this is Defense News Weekly. Welcome to this week's edition of Defense News Weekly. I'm Jill Toro, and for Jeff Martin, who's on assignment in Singapore. We've got a busy show this week, including our preview of the upcoming defense budget. But before we get into that, here's some headlines from this week. First up is news that the U.S. Special Operations Command will be moving forward with their armed overwatch plans, independent of the U.S. Air Force, with plans to buy up to 75 aircraft. This means, effectively, that SOCOM will go it alone on buying a light attack aircraft independent of the Air Force. An industry day is set to be held next month, and companies like Sierra Nevada and Textron will certainly respond, as well as other contractors like Air Tractor. A new nuclear warhead is now at sea on a Navy submarine. According to a Pentagon release, the new W-75-2 low-yield weapon is now deployed. Independent reports say the warhead has been deployed on the USS Tennessee, which has served as a debut submarine before other Trident missile modifications. One key reason it was deployed so quick is that it's a modified version of the current high-yield warhead. The destroyer Fitzgerald, badly damaged in a 2017 collision that killed 7 sailors, is back at sea for the first time since arriving at the shipyard in Mississippi 2 years ago. It's in the process of getting a full shakedown of all systems before rejoining the fleet. One aspect of the Fitzgerald's damage that made things difficult was that the ship's superstructure was warped, requiring a lot of work to realign it, and the huge radar on board. And the U.S. Navy is planning to increase the arsenal of weapons that the P-8 maritime patrol aircraft can carry, as it's looking to add the long-range anti-ship missile, air-launched mines, and other bombs to the aircraft's carrying capacity. This is a big step in truly making the P-8 a bomber as well as a patrol plane. Work to integrate these weapons is set to start in 2021 and will run through 2026. And the U.S. Army wants to greatly expand its pre-positioned stocks in the Pacific, which include enough equipment right now for an armored brigade in Korea. The news came from Army Material Command's General Gus Perna, who told the Defense Writers Group that the PLA is still in the works, but that the upcoming Defender Pacific exercises will inform the process. Potential sites for an expansion include Hawaii, Japan, and even another set in Korea. The U.S. Navy and Boeing have demonstrated a new capability for the EA-18G Growler, operating 2 of them remotely from a 3rd aircraft. It's a big step forward and proves the capability for a manned fighter to control other aircraft. While the 2 Growlers had pilots on board, just in case, they were operated remotely after takeoff. Tests took place at Patuxent River Test Center in Maryland and are just the first step in the Navy's plan to use unmanned aircraft and carrier air wings. Next week, the fiscal year 2021 budget is set to be released, the first under Secretary Mark Esper. To preview the massive budget request and what we're looking forward to, Jeff Martin and Aaron Mehta sat down to discuss it. Here's their interview.
Aaron, thanks for chatting with me here today about the upcoming 2021 budget. It's February again in D.C. We have a budget rollout next week. What are you expecting?
Yeah, it's nice to have the budget actually come out when it's supposed to.
Heaven forbid, right?
It's amazing. Yeah, so there's actually, for the first time in a couple of years, going to be a certain amount of stability and expectations in this budget. We know what the top line is already. It's going to be $740 billion for defense. That's under the budget agreement that was reached towards the end of 2019, so we kind of know what that number is. That's less than the Pentagon had hoped to have in its previous budget rollouts, expecting to kind of growth year over year, but that was kind of the trade-off that had to get done on the defense side with that budget deal.
And so with that, one thing you wrote a great article that I read over the weekend about the impact of inflation on this and how we aren't seeing the real growth that both Dunford and Mehta said the Pentagon needed. What's that impact and why isn't that?
Yeah, so both former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis and Joe Dunford, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in 2017 and then a little bit in 2018 during their testimonies around the budget, said the Pentagon needs 3 to 5% real growth, so that means not overinflation, not just to develop new capabilities, but to keep basically what they have going and to maintain what advantage there is over China right now. Obviously, that's not a number that's happening. It's more like 1% growth under this deal.
Less than 1%.
Less than 1% growth. Yeah. There you go. So, yeah, it's not what the Pentagon has been saying they needed. Now, you talk to some experts and they say, okay, 3 to 5%, that was always going to be an idealized goal. That was always going to be maybe tough to get. In early 2017, it looked possible, and we did get a big jump in defense in the first Trump budget and the second Trump budget. But realistically, that probably wasn't going to happen year over year the way that Mattis and Dunford hoped. What's the impact? O&M accounts, operations and maintenance, those are the ones that are probably going to get hit hardest. We know that maintenance has been a long-standing issue for the Pentagon. Essentially, look, if you're not getting that kind of growth, you need to make a choice, as the Pentagon continuously says, between modernization and upkeep. And usually what happens is you take a certain amount of risk in upkeep to get to those modernization priorities, which is something that the now Secretary, Mark Esper, has been very focused on.
And so how does one square the idea of Trump talking about a military buildup with basically negative, almost negative growth with inflation?
Yeah, I mean, it's true Trump has hit record highs on defense spending. But the idea that, as he sometimes says, we've rebuilt the military, it's just not true. How bad shape the military is in depends on who you talk to. I think a lot of people will look at it and say military still has plenty of money and plenty of people and is doing fine. Maybe just can't do that two-war construct, which we've traditionally heard about. Maybe it's not modernizing the rate that a lot of people would like it to, particularly in relation to China. This is where trade-offs come out. And you've seen this kind of play out with what Secretary Esper has termed the night court, which was this process he started in the Army when he was Secretary of the Army, essentially going in and saying, okay, what systems do we no longer need? What systems were geared more to Iraq, Afghanistan than perhaps to China or Russia? Can we cut those and reinvest those in different ways? Found a lot of savings in the Army, had some success with that, and managed to convince the Hill in a lot of cases that some of those changes were good. Now he's trying to do this on a broader scale, the Pentagon, and we're going to see what that looks like.
So we know the Air Force has said they've done a similar type of process to what the Army did. Navy hasn't really, Navy typical obfuscating. Right. The Marines have said they definitely want to cut. Do you see that? So we may necessarily have a less overall growth, but more room to maneuver within, because if you've made savings within, your top number doesn't need to go up as much.
Yeah, so there's kind of a couple different factors to this. The first is the savings efficiencies portion of it. Esper said there's been $5 billion in savings found. We've repeatedly asked for details on that and have not been given them from the Pentagon. So right now we kind of have to take it at his word. But you talk to people in Esper's team and they say, hey, those $5 billion are being plunged back into the budget. We're going to invest those in new things like AI, into hypersonic weapons, into R&D investments to try to help that future modernization happen. So that's one portion of it. The second portion is the services individually going through and saying, okay, we can cut this, we need to keep this, here's a capability we can lose. The Marines in particular are being very aggressive on this. The new Marine Commandant, Berger, has been very upfront saying, a lot of the systems that we've used for years simply don't fit anymore. We need to become a China-focused force. We need to find new stuff. And then the third part is this kind of broader review that Esper is doing, which is about force posture, where we're seeing some of the combatant commands perhaps being tweaked, some perhaps losing equipment and people, some perhaps gaining equipment and people. It's all about the national defense strategy with Mark Esper. He talks about the NDS all the time, which essentially is code word for China, China, China.
And so with all of that, this will be our third budget rollout under Trump with 3 separate SecDefs. Yeah. What does that exactly mean for continuity?
It's actually, it's interesting because you would think each SecDef has time to put their stamp on things. But kind of the way that the budgets are worked on and the way that the SecDef changes have happened, each SecDef who's come in, we've had obviously Mattis, then you temporarily had Shanahan, and now you have Esper, have only been able to put so much work on. I actually asked Mark Esper about this during a recent trip with him and said, what does the Esper budget look like? And he said, well, look, I started in August. I'm going to have time to tweak a little bit of things, but most of the budget was cooked. And that's true. Mostly the budgets from the services and OSD are cooked by the end of the fiscal year, which is, say, September. And then you go through kind of the process fighting and working with the White House on them. So a lot of the stuff that Esper wants to do, I think, is actually going to be in the next budget, which, of course, gets tricky because Esper can put all his priorities in, but then if the Trump administration loses the election in November and a new president comes in, that new president's going to probably say, hold on, why am I using the budget from the last guy? And do exactly what Trump did, which was delay the budget release in 2017 when he got the Obama budget, tweak it, make changes, and make it more to fit their vision. So how much impact is this going to have from Esper? I think you're going to see some tweaks around it. I think you're going to see investments in R&D. But some of the big movements that he's talking about are being designed for next year which raises the question of whether they'll ever happen or not.
So it's kind of funny, Secretary Mattis had to deal with a kind of an Ash Carter plus budget, and then you have Shanahan dealing with a Mattis budget, and Esper dealing with a budget that was presumably impacted a lot by Shanahan before he left the department. Do you think Trump will ever get a Pentagon defense secretary who can create their own budget, or are we just kind of in a almost a death spiral of it?
You know, I think there's a lot of continuity from Mattis's ideas. If you talk to Shanahan and also Esper, were both big proponents of the national defense strategy, by which, again, I mean China. I mean, Shanahan said the message when Shanahan took over from Mattis was literally China, China, China. So there is a lot of continuity there, and there's a lot in terms of the importance of certain investments and where that money might go. That said, each one's tried to make their own little tweak, and each person's had their own priorities. And of course, the wild card in all of this is we saw just at the beginning of the year, at a time when everyone's saying great power competition, all of a sudden Iran's throwing ballistic missiles at everyone. So the wild cards are always there. Everyone says in the last 10 years or so, we need to start focusing outside of Iraq and Afghanistan to various extents. And the truth is, every time somebody tries to leave, it just gets sucked back in. So how that impacts the budget going forward is its own issue.
Is there a particular area you're going to be first thing you pull up, you get the budget documents, what's the first thing you think you're going to look for?
Yeah, I want to see where the R&D investments are for two reasons. One is that's the sign of how much the Pentagon is actually putting its money behind its mouth. If everything's about China and AI and new capabilities, then I want to know what they're actually investing in that. It can be relatively small dollars because it's early days, but it's still important. The other thing is, that's a great comparison to, let's say, where the priorities are going to go. Is money going to R&D that seems more focused on China versus new capabilities that might be good for Russia? What does the investment regionally look like? Are we going to see a plus up or a decrease in the European Defense Initiative, which is essentially a pot of money to help Europe grow? They took a cut last year for the first time. Congress then threw money back in to kind of deal with that. Munitions is another thing I like to track year over year. We know that they're expanding more munitions in Afghanistan than in previous years under the Trump administration. So how's that impacting costs and investments? And the last thing to always keep in mind with this is that the budget gets rolled out. There'll be a lot of information written about it. We'll have a whole landing page. You can see all our stories they'll put up there. And then Congress will say, that's a great looking budget. We're going to tear it apart and do what we want.
That was going to be my next question. Does this even matter?
Yeah, I mean, it matters because it gives you a sense of Pentagon priorities. And the Pentagon isn't just doing this and not talking to Congress. They're prepping the landscape. And generally, the Pentagon budget will be 80 to 90% what is actually in there will end up getting through. The 10% is really interesting and can often be a real fight. And I think this Congress, again, with a Democratic House and a Republican Senate coming out of impeachment in an election year, getting them to agree on stuff, anything controversial, is going to be really hard to kind of square that circle on.
Great. Aaron, thanks for the time on this. I look forward to reading your coverage.
Thanks, Jeff.
To keep up to date with all of our coverage, be sure to visit our Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn pages. Also, be sure to add us on Apple's News app and other platforms for the latest updates. When we come back, we'll look at the problem of Congress and tech literacy. A big problem in Congress that's surfaced in recent years is tech literacy. So at a recent roundtable hosted by Defense News, our panel discussed what could be done about it and the impact it has on technology development. Take a look.
We haven't talked that much about Congress. We talked a little bit about the budget being an issue. We're talking about the primes, about how you end up with a program with offices in every congressional district. But do you think there's an understanding in Congress on the Hill about the kind of issues that we're talking about the
Will
fixes?
Hurd understands it. I think Dan Crenshaw understands it. I think those guys are outliers. I think there needs to be more broad-based education across Congress. I mean, you could probably speak a bit more. I mean, it's
Will is like a consummate moderate that is retiring. I think probably because he's tired of fighting the partisan battle.
Which is a problem.
It's bad for
we
America.
need guys like Will.
Yeah, it's really bad for America that we're losing Will Hurd in Congress. We need more people like that are willing to, dig into the nitty-gritty of these complex tech issues. I think it's increasingly more common for members to understand. I think the governor of Georgia just appointed as a temporary interim senator a CEO of a blockchain company. So there are moves that are happening that I think people are getting an awareness that some of these things are maybe not well suited demographically to the people that we've elected into Congress. It's an uphill battle, and it's going to take a long time. It requires a generational shift at the end of the day.
Then if it requires a generational shift, then does that create another massive roadblock to what we're talking about needing to get some of the stuff through the next couple of years?
And getting contracts awarded.
Tech literacy, I actually think it's a big roadblock.
Yeah.
And again, I mean, these are issues that have sprung up in the last 30 years, and most of the people in Congress are not tech native.
Right.
I mean, I personally am not considered tech native. You have a whole generation below us that understands technology because they have grown up with technology and it is intuitive. So I do think that this is going to be something that takes generations to completely fix, but we can get a head start on it.
Yeah.
And I think Congress is finally starting to realize that they do have a tech literacy problem. I'm sure they read the tweets when Mark Zuckerberg speaks in front of them that
Right.
they are asking the wrong questions. They don't understand business models. They don't understand certain things about how technology works. And so people like us spend a lot of time in Washington just going through the basics. And I think more and more of that is needed to make sure that tech literacy doesn't stand in the way.
But I think the ship has started to turn on that. The House just stood up the Future of Defense Task Force, and a lot of bodies in Congress are stood up for just gathering info. But they're calling folks up. They're talking about technology, what the future of defense looks like from an autonomous weapons perspective, and some of the high tech areas. So I think you're right. I think it's starting to shift and bring folks up to bring more awareness on that.
But if you look at the economics, step one, I suppose, is them understanding the need for the technology and the potential of the technology. Mm-hmm. But then I would imagine step two, but it's really what's needed now, is them enabling the investment and figuring out, changing how they are funding various things to enable more contracts to be awarded, more exploratory contracts. The Pentagon doesn't really say, here is money for you to start to develop what maybe has some great potential. That's what the VC community tends to do, but the Pentagon almost needs to have the same mindset to enable that. So there's the understanding of the technology, but then there's also the understanding that the way you are literally funding things right now is not allowing these companies to kind of come forward with capabilities. So
over time, I think it will become more obvious. Kind of like how we were talking before about Title 10, US 2377, the lawsuits from Palantir and SpaceX. Mm-hmm. These types of things are now at least in recent memory for Congress, and so they have some awareness of the issues that are being faced. It's much easier now to walk into a congressional office and say hey, here's the problem that we're facing, or hey, here's the policy changes that we would need. And there are enough bodies like DIU, like Incatel, like AFWorks, SoftWorks, like the Defense Innovation Board, DSB 809. There are places where you can go to express the need for change, and oftentimes you do see that language coming into the NDAAs in the out years. But I think it is a longer-term cultural battle, to be sure.
Don't go away. When we come back, we'll sit down with the new Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps to talk about the future of the Corps' most important weapon, its Marines. On this week's Money Minute, Navy Federal Credit Union personal finance expert Jeanette Mack offers her latest tips.
All good business owners know to track their expenses all year long to make it easier when it's time to file their tax returns. It's the best financial favor you can do for your business and your sanity. But even the best of us procrastinate or aren't fully prepared by tax time. You might even be tempted to ask for an extension. Not a great idea. The time is now to get organized so you're not rushing and missing out on all you're due to get back. Before you fill out any forms, gather all necessary records and have them in front of you when reporting company earnings and expenses. The way you operate your business determines the appropriate tax forms to use, so it's important to make sure it's categorized accurately. This will also help you to take advantage of any deductions where possible. Pay attention to deadlines and pay periods too. Partnerships and multi-member LLCs may not have the same filing deadlines as sole proprietors and single-member LLCs. Sole proprietors also must pay estimated taxes each quarter. To avoid any penalties, stay on top of key tax dates during the year. The best way to stay on top of tax requirements and important information is to check irs.gov. And of course, to work with a great business tax advisor. They'll make sure you're not leaving anything undone or money on the table.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. To get more defense news coverage, be sure to visit our website at defensenews.com and subscribe to our early bird brief delivered to your inbox every weekday morning to get you ready to start the day. And don't go away. When we come back, we'll sit down with the new Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps to talk about the future of the Corps' most important weapon, its Marines. Recently, Marine Corps Times sat down with Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps Troy Black to talk about his efforts to develop better Marines as the service is in the middle of a transformation. Here's what he had to say.
So what is the Sergeant Major's role in implementing the Commandant's Planning Guidance?
So the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps' role in implementing the Commandant's Planning Guidance is pretty broad, to be frank. As soon as General Berger came on deck, he gave a brief to myself, Sergeant Major Green as he was outgoing, and the senior enlisted leadership of the Marine Corps, and actually tasked us. Go after a couple of things. Mainly focus on how can we better develop Marines, train Marines, lead Marines. So that's what we've been focused on over the course of the first 6 months of being here.
And how do these February seminars play into that?
So specifically, we spend a lot of time when we talk about developing a force, talking about things, capabilities, right? We're going to be able to fight in a certain way. We're going to fight with this sort of equipment. What we don't always do is invest a lot of time in developing the Marines. They're going to fly those planes, shoot those weapons, drive that, or whatever the capability is going to be. So with that in mind, we looked at putting together 3 different focus areas that are specifically looking at how to better develop Marines. One, recruiting to retention, talent management, talent development. Basically looking at recruiters find the very best citizens that we have that join the United States Marine Corps. They do a fabulous job. There's no hidden pool that we're not tapping into that are not coming in the Marine Corps. What we do with them after that, how do we develop that talent? Recruiter found talent, goes to recruit training, goes to an MOS school, and then what? We manage those Marines through performance evaluation. We manage them through assignments. We manage them through further training. We manage them through retention. We manage how we take care of Marines. But how we develop them is a whole different discussion.
So if you can summarize this real quick, it's pretty much we're recruiting what we're going to recruit. How do we make sure they stay out throughout their career and fill all the spaces that the Marine Corps requires?
Right. And so talk about development for a moment. One of the other groups is enlisted professional personal development. I'd break that down into 3 categories. Enlisted professional military education, what you and I remember as the Lance Corporal Seminar, Corporal's Course, all the way up to our advanced school for gunnery sergeants. That is common PME, professional military education, that every single Marine has to have that's enlisted. What is its curriculum supposed to look like? Things that are common to me and you as Marines, right? Now, professional development, you grew up as an artilleryman. I grew up as an infantryman. We're not going to go to the same school to make us better at our MOS. That's professional development. And other schools that we're going to go to that enhance our capabilities, warfighting capabilities, MOS responsibilities. And there's that last leg, which is personal development. Think college. Think advanced certifications. Think vocational trades. These are another leg of our educational and enlisted development that we're looking at right now.
Another question that came up was how the Corps plans to improve its training of the smartphone generation. Here's that portion of the interview.
Are you going to require certain senior enlisted staff NCOs to have degrees?
Right now, there is not a requirement. Can you envision in the future that there would be? Absolutely. How we get there and what that looks like over time, 10, 15 years down the road, once we actually have a mechanism or a process or a capability to do that, it's feasible, visionary that we could get there.
How are you going to make that capability, incentivize enlisted Marines to go to college and make it available for them with their busy schedule?
So a couple of things. We talked about PME, we talked about professional development, we talked about this collegiate leg. Right now, Marine Corps University has already started a program that can mash up everything a Marine does, add to it some actual college credential classes. Think your core competencies, your math or your English, those things you have to have that are core, add them to what we learn, and then, can you accredit that stuff and get an associate's degree or maybe beyond that? I would offer also that the Navy has created the Office of the Chief Learning Officer of the Navy. And the CLO, Chief Learning Officer of the Navy, is developing right now what's called the Navy Community College, which is going to take that a step further and actually is reaching out to colleges right now to start to accredit, one, many of the things that we do already to develop the enlisted force, and then offer a more flexible program to meet the rest of those core competencies. So now you start to accumulate accreditation, add it to what you've already done, why your required training has been going on, and then figure out ways to get past to associates and advanced bachelor's degrees.
What's the advantage for a staff sergeant, gunnery sergeant who has a degree versus one that doesn't?
Right now, there's no specific required advantage. However, what we know is someone who's more educated probably is a little more broad in thought. Probably has developed more critical thinking skills. And I would offer it to you, if you look how the Commandant is talking about how we're going to fight in the future, 10, 15 years down the road, how we're going to operate in distributed fashion. That's going to require more and more responsibility on the shoulders of staff and non-commissioned officers that currently really resides in our lieutenants and captains, our junior officers. In order to do that, you start to broaden that critical thinking capability. You do that through accreditation or accredited curriculum.
That's all we have time for this week, but if you want to see and read more, be sure to head over to defensenews.com. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.